You are currently in the Defining the Scope track. This is the talk, The Myth of 12 More Bytes, from Alex Stamos and Tom Ritter.
Thank you. Thanks, guys. Thanks for coming to the coveted last track of the day. Real happy to be here. And we're going to try to get out of here quickly and on time. So we're going to get started and go real quickly because we have something like 327 slides to get through in 60 minutes. So I'm Alex Stamos.
And I'm Tom Ritter.
We work for Artemis and ISEC partners, respectively, and we are talking about the future of enterprise architectures, internet architectures, and how attackers and security experts are going to have to adjust to that. The three major technologies we're talking about, changes that are happening starting now and will really be hitting 5, 6, 7 years from now, is IPv6, DNSSEC, and the new gTLD program. So because we don't expect everybody to already have a deep technical background in those, we're going to start with about 20 to 30 minutes going over those new technologies and talking about some of the specific technical issues with them. And then we'll have about 20 minutes on the big picture on how enterprise architectures and security designs are going to have to change in reaction to this. And then hopefully we have a couple of minutes before all of the really cool hackers come and do the Pony Awards. So I sometimes like to put our conclusions up front so you guys can have an idea of the themes we're trying to hit and have them in mind as we go through. And so real quickly, the things that we're trying to get you to learn from this. One, right now, 2012, the internet infrastructure is changing in a way that is unprecedented for the last 25 to 30 years. It's really, you have to go back to the early 80s to a point where fundamental changes are happening like they're happening right now. And that's great. I think that's a good thing. And it's quite possible this is the last time that we'll have this within our lifetimes. That these are changes that we're going to have to live with for 50, 60, 70 years as it becomes less and less practical to have wide-scale upgrades in the future. One of the big kind of themes of these changes is the elimination of artificial scarcity, specifically in the assignment of IP addresses and the creation of names in the DNS. Artificial scarcity is something that you never think is a good thing. Right? You never think, why do you create a rule to make things scarce when it's electronics, it's computers, and things should be infinitely available? But it turns out that the assumption of scarcity has led into lots of decisions about security practices and especially about how security products are built. And we're going to talk about how the elimination of that scarcity changes a lot of things and breaks a lot of stuff. One of the things that come out of the scarcity problem is that the trust that we have in the identity of principals on the internet, of both clients and servers, is going to get much more complicated. One of the results of this is that enterprise architecture is going to look very different. We've been pretty lazy in that we're still building production and office networks in pretty much the same way that we built them in, say, 1997, 1998. And that's not going to be true in 2017. The architectures will have to be significantly different if you want to adopt these technologies and get the pros from them. And all the crap you've bought is going to break. So just keep that in mind. Great. So I'm going to turn it over to Tom for a bit. Yep.
Thanks, Alex. So we've re-architected the foundation of the internet, and now we're trying to deploy it. And the biggest part is IPv6. So this is a stack of how we communicate on the internet. And people think that IPv6 just changes one part, that we're just adding 12 bytes to the IP address. But really, we're modifying several protocols. And we're adding new ones, like the ones in green in the upper right on top of ICMP. And we're even removing ones. I mean, when was the last time we actually took something out? And the things that we're changing the most are the things that network administrators have to worry about the most. So how computers get addresses on the network and figure out who to talk to and who to trust. So how does one get an IPv6 address? Well, the most common method is called SLAC, or Stateless Address Autoconfiguration. And the first step in SLAC is to give yourself a linked local address that starts with FE80. And this is akin to the 169.254 addresses that you get in IPv4 when you can't connect anywhere. But with this address, you can start communicating with other stuff that's nearby. And the first communication you send is, hey, what network am I in? And the response will come back with a 64-bit prefix. Now, you take your MAC address, you translate it slightly, and you come up with the last 64 bits. So you combine that value with the prefix, and you've assigned yourself a globally routable IPv6 address. But there's a pretty big hitch to this plan. So MAC addresses are designed to be globally unique, and now you're broadcasting a globally unique identifier in the second half of your IPv6 address, no matter what network you're on. So, as an example, visit my website and then shut down. Wipe your laptop. Don't just clear cookies, but reinstall a new operating system. Go to Asia, visit my website again, and I can correlate those two visits because no one else is going to have the same last 64 bits of that address. That's an ever cookie you can't clear. Only changing your MAC address would change it. Now, the solution was to just generate a random 64 bits for the lower half of the address, and that's going to change regularly. But you still have that other address. In IPv6, it's standard to have multiple addresses per interface, but this random second half privacy address will be the one that's preferred for outgoing communications to the internet. So you're going to want to make sure, especially for your personal machines, that these privacy addresses are in use and are preferred. But if you don't like this idea of Slack, you don't have to use it. DHCP hasn't gone away, but it is much less important. You don't really need it. You can use Slack. But if you want to use or require DHCP, you can configure your routers such that your clients won't perform Slack, and they'll go looking to a DHCP server for an address. And they'll get an assigned one, and you can track all of this just like you do today. But the default is Slack. Windows will happily perform Slack by default. And Windows actually prefers IPv6 over IPv4. So what you wind up with is all of your Windows 7 machines on your network are just sitting around waiting for someone to come along and help them talk IPv6. And it doesn't have to be you. This isn't a new thing. You know, it's been talked about at other conferences. It's been discussed on mailing lists. And there's even an RFC published about it. But you still have to do something proactively to stop this attack. And I'll talk a little bit more about that. What it comes down to is basically careful switch management. So something that has changed a lot from IPv4 to IPv6 is ICMP. ICMP is now critical infrastructure. It can't be blindly dropped or rejected. You don't necessarily have to allow everything in or out or across every segment, but you can't blindly drop everything everywhere. And that's because the protocols are built on top of ICMP, including Slack and neighbor discovery. And those are critical for your network to actually do anything. So this ties into that careful switch management. ICMP is the way by which your computer finds the router so it can talk to the broader network. But these protocols aren't actually secure. Actually, pretty much all of them are unauthenticated and can be spoofed by anyone on the segment. So that message sent out from your router saying, hey, I can route your traffic, doesn't have to come from your router. Anyone on the network segment can send it. With IPv4, we use ARP, or Address Resolution Protocol, to find out who else is on the local network and what IP they have. In IPv6, that's called neighbor discovery, but it works the exact same way. Just like there's ARP spoofing attacks, there's now neighbor discovery spoofing attacks. I'll give one more example. Because clients can assign themselves an IPv6 address and use it to start talking on the network, there's a possibility, however remote, that two computers would wind up with the same address. Most likely due to a misconfiguration, but still, technically possible. Duplicate address detection is supposed to resolve that. You send out a message saying, hey, I'm going to give myself this address. Does anyone else have it? And in pretty much all the cases, you should not get any response back. But you could. There's a tool to apply to every single duplicate address check and prevent people from giving themselves an IP. So these are some of the technical issues that you have to worry about on the inside of your network. But the borders of your network need thought too. The devices you use there and the vendors you buy them from have some tough questions to answer. This is what the IPv6 packet format looks like. We have a fixed size header with big spaces for the large source and destination address, followed by the data. But you can put extension headers in between the original header and the data to convey different options to the routers along the path. And the reason these extension headers are a problem is you can have multiple of them, and they can result in a packet being fragmented. When a packet is fragmented like this, the TCP header winds up in the second fragment. That's the header with the port information. That's needed for your firewall. So what this means is that according to the IPv6 spec, stateless firewall filtering is impossible. Your firewall has to keep track of the packet fragments or drop potentially legitimate traffic. Now, there are talks about restricting the spec, so this isn't an issue, but until then, we're still going to have to test the firewalls and see how they handle this fragmented traffic. Do they let things, do they automatically drop fragments, which would be the safest, but potentially could break things? Do they do stateful filtering, which could open up a denial of service attack? Or do they default allow fragments through, which would be the most dangerous? And another thing that you're going to have to deal with on the perimeter and internally is the transition and the translation mechanisms. So a transition mechanism allows two IPv6 islands to talk to one another. And this is important because you're going to wind up with an IPv6 island inside of your organization at some point, even if it's just for testing. And translation, on the other hand, lets IPv6 talk to IPv4 and vice versa. Now, there are a lot of transition mechanisms, and I don't have time to cover them all, but I do want to talk about the scariest of them, and that's Teredo. So this can allow hosts inside of your network to act as servers and let clients punch through your firewall to talk to them. So the very thing that firewalls were designed to prevent. You can block Teredo, and you can block all of these transition mechanisms, but you have to take proactive steps to do so. If you don't, you're simply leaving yourself vulnerable to clients inside your network using IPv6 to bypass everything inside your network. Your firewalls, any sort of DPI system you have, auditing, logging, proxies. And to give an example, Teredo is built into the most popular BitTorrent application out there. There's a button that says, use Teredo. Please bypass my employer's firewall. On the administrative side, if you want to deploy IPv6 internally, you need to deploy NAT64 with DNSSEC to allow your IPv6 hosts to talk to the IPv4 internet. Otherwise, they won't really be able to do much, really anything. And there's a lot more. There's a lot more things that we could talk about, but we thought these were the important technical ones. Something that does come up a lot is how the IPv6 address space is so large that I'll be able to hide hosts inside of it, so external scans won't be able to find them. That's not entirely true. There are techniques to scan IPv6 efficiently on the internet side and on the intranet side. The intranet side is already implemented in Nmap. These may get closed in the future, and you can close the intranet ones yourself, but for now they work pretty well. And there's a bunch of other things. There's a ton on multicast. There's node querying. There's potential specification improvements to look at. But I want to talk about DNSSEC too. And DNSSEC was designed to provide authenticity for DNS requests, of course. Without that, you can be attacked by someone forging the responses. And this can happen because you experience it regularly, because you stay in hotels. So you connect to the internet in your hotel room, and you get redirected to some splash screen or some payment gateway. That's a DNS man in the middle. It's an active attack on you. And what if, instead of redirecting you to the payment gateway, it sent you to a replica of your company's webmail or VPN server? So DNSSEC lets you authenticate a site you've never visited before, like AT&T.com. And this is because everyone here trusts a single person, ICANN. ICANN is the root, and ICANN certifies a top-level domain, like .com, and the person who operates it, VeriSign. So now you trust VeriSign because ICANN trusts VeriSign. And VeriSign, in turn, certifies AT&T.com. So you can trust AT&T.com because this chain is correct and valid. DNSSEC gives your users a way to trust you even if they've never met you before. That's a very difficult problem to solve. I'm going to talk about in just a second. But this magic cryptography only works when someone actually checks the signatures. It makes sense that the signature checking, that is a validating DNSSEC resolver, would sit inside of the client. But verifying signatures is slow. It's still being debated where this validator is going to wind up sitting. In some models, the validator is not in the client at all. It's actually run by the ISP, which is not something that you would likely want to trust. So you want to look into both individual applications, whether they're doing validation on DNSSEC queries, and whether your DNS servers that you're running yourself perform the validation for your clients. But about these signatures, so everything you get from DNSSEC is signed. A 32-bit IP address has a corresponding 250 or 260 byte signature. And you can get a lot of data back in these DNS requests. In fact, you can get so much data back that it overflows DNS's UDP limit of 512 bytes. The Wireshark shows about a kilobyte response. That's a problem. We have solutions. eDNS, or extension mechanisms for DNS, ups the the UDP limit to 4K, and DNS over TCP has no size limit at all. But these solutions aren't deployed. A group at ICANN tested 24 residential or simple routers, and you can see the numbers. The majority of them could not handle these large DNS replies. And that's a problem because it's the type of problem that's going to cause silent failures on a very small percentage of queries. The type of thing that's extremely difficult to track down and debug. And remember that everything is signed, which resulted in some engineering which isn't immediately obvious. So if you heard about DNSSEC leaking private subdomains, I'm going to explain why things wound up the way they are and what attacks needed to be mitigated. So let's take an example. I'm going to ask where a non-existing subdomain is. And I get back a reply saying, doesn't exist.att.com doesn't actually exist. A signed reply stating that. Well, that signed reply enables a denial of service attack, because I can just keep requesting subdomains that don't exist and make you sign all of those replies. That's computationally expensive. So maybe the solution is to have one generic response, no record. Sign that and return that whenever a subdomain doesn't exist. But that doesn't work either, because an attacker who's performing a man-in-the-middle attack can take that signed, no record response and give it to you for any subdomain that he doesn't want you to know about. And because it's signed, you'll trust it. It looks completely valid. So the solution was to sign a range and state that there was no subdomain between that range. So I know that doesn't exist.att.com doesn't actually exist because there is no subdomain between admin.att.com and keyserver.att.com. Going alphabetically, there's nothing between A and K. These responses can be pre-signed, and they mitigate both the denial of service and the man-in-the-middle attack. And of course, open the information disclosure issue. I can enumerate all the subdomains for a server by using these range responses. And that's a pretty big concern for a lot of companies. And in response, a solution was developed that hides the subdomains. It's called NSEC3, and it hashes the subdomains so the names aren't exposed. So it's a little bit roundabout, but this gives all the security properties that we need. It keeps the information private, and it doesn't open us up to forgeries or man-in-the-middles or denial of service attacks on online key signing or online response signing. So besides authenticated responses, we're seeing a trend of using DNSSEC to bootstrap other protocols. So with plain DNS, we make a request, we get back a response. Now that response is authenticated. We know it wasn't altered by a man-in-the-middle or faked by an impersonator. Now we're going to start asking for more data than just an IP address. For example, we'll ask for an SSL certificate also. And when we get that SSL certificate via DNSSEC, we'll hold it over here, and then we're going to go talk to the server over SSL. And we'll compare them and make sure that they match. And if they don't match, we know that something has gone wrong. So we don't have to just trust the certificate authorities. We have two different PKI infrastructures, and an attacker would have to subvert both of them to pull off an attack. DNSSEC gives us a generic method to bootstrap the security of other protocols. And this is one of the hardest parts of any security protocol. If you've never talked to someone before, how do you know you're talking to the right person? And DNSSEC provides a solution to that. Assuming you trust that DNS trust infrastructure, that chain, clients can be bootstrapped to talk to you securely by giving them a certificate or a public key or a fingerprint over DNSSEC. And that's exactly some of the applications that we're seeing. So putting SSL certificates into DNSSEC allows me to have either an alternative or a backup to the certificate authority system. And many products already do update checks, is there a new version, over DNS. Now that's an authenticated check for a product update. And there's more esoteric applications. We've had solutions for putting OpenPGP and SSH fingerprints into DNS for a while. Now they can actually have some authenticity behind them. And there's a ton of disparate possibilities. To give us an example of something farther from the norm, something Alex and I are working on is called Domain Policy Framework. And there's two halves to it. The first half is a site can get a policy that can be delivered securely to a client, like a web browser. And that tells the client how to behave. For example, only speak to me over TLS 1.1 and don't run any plugins. So if I receive an embed tag with a Java applet, I know that something is going wrong here, and I can block it outright. And the second half applies this policy to an entire top-level domain. For example, .secure. So a browser can actually hard code that any domain ending in .secure must be talked to only over SSL. And this is awesome, because it lets us carve out portions of the internet where we don't have to be bug compatible. Browsers will downgrade SSL connections to older versions of the protocol because some small percentage of servers can't handle that newer version. So we never really get the benefits of this new protocol because an active attacker can always make us downgrade. Domain policy lets us securely block this downgrade behavior and incrementally upgrade the internet. And if that sounds interesting to you, please check out domainpolicy.org or talk to us afterwards. But now I want to hand it over to Alice to talk about mapping a name to a number.
Thanks, Tom. So who here has dealt with ICANN before? Well, let me start. Who here works for ICANN? Where's Jeff Moss and Rod Beckstrom? You guys want to raise your hands? Okay, who has ever been to an ICANN meeting? Yeah, one person in the back, 2, 3. Yes, may God have mercy on your soul. Right, so I'm going to give a quick little background to what ICANN is, how we got to where we are right now, and then we'll talk about the new gTLD program. So, gTLD means generic top-level domain. All of the top-level domains on the internet split into two categories: CC-TLDs, country code TLDs, so that's .uk, .ly, .us, and then the generic gTLDs, which are not supposed to be region-specific, and are run by commercial organizations and not chartered by a specific government. And right now we have 21 of those. And if things go according to plan as currently designed, by the end of next year or early in 2014, we'll have over 1,400 new gTLDs, which is obviously the greatest and largest expansion of the internet namespace in history. And so, who is running this? So everybody's heard of ICANN. Very few people or nobody really understands what ICANN is. Back in the dark ages of the internet, pre-1998, the namespace and IANA were pretty much run by one guy out of USC, which is a difficult thing to admit from anybody from a different Pac-10 school who hates USC. But there's one guy at USC, and that didn't seem like a really sustainable model. A lot of other governments wanted to get involved. They didn't want one American university running some very critical functions. And so in 1998, ICANN was chartered in Marina del Rey, California, given a contract by the US Department of Commerce to run the internet in a more democratic fashion. And the idea of ICANN is this thing called the multi-stakeholder model. And the idea is that you have these different groups that represent different stakeholders. Stakeholders are normal internet users like you, internet experts, companies that host servers, intellectual property interests, registries, registrars. All those kinds of people fall into different categories. And then those different stakeholder groups elect a board of directors who then run ICANN and make the decisions on how the namespace and the IP space are given out. There are 21 directors in the board of directors. 15 of them can vote, 6 can't. And you saw how nobody raised their hand in here, right? If I did that at any reasonably technical conference, even if I went to Usenix, and I asked the same question of this many people, you'd have the same number of folks saying they participate in the ICANN process. And the result of the fact that none of us pretty much participate in the ICANN process means that the people who run the internet don't actually know how the internet works, which you may consider to be a bad thing. This is a standard interview question. If you want a job at ISEC Partners, I like to ask, give you a pen and give you a whiteboard and say, explain to me how the internet works in 10 minutes, right? And depending on what their focus is, you'll find out something about them, right? If they're a web person, they'll say, well, web browser does a DNS request and does an HTTP connection, it pulls HTML down. And if they're a network person, you're going to hear terms like BGP and autonomous system. If you ask any of the ICANN board of directors, they're going to say, well, the US Department of Commerce contracts us, and then we have a contract with VeriSign, and then they make magic happen, and then it all happens. There are a number of people on the board of directors who actually know what they're talking about. Unfortunately, almost all of them aren't allowed to vote. So as a result, those are the people who are the liaisons from these technical groups who are all non-voting members. So the people who you might respect from a technical position actually are not allowed to vote. The rest of these people are almost all lawyers. And so the internet's being run by lawyers, and that's because people like us don't work there. And the other reason is ICANN is ridiculously complex. And my theory is the complexity, it's two things. One, it's fractal, right? My theory is you can't actually create a flow chart of the ICANN structure because you'll never find a place where you can't stop zooming anymore, right? Like a Mandelbrot set. Like if you zoom into this, the generic name services organization, you end up with this structure. This is inside the GNSO. At the top, there's another board called the GNSO Council. There are 2 houses, the contracted and non-contracted parties house. These are the registry, registrar, commercial, and non-commercial stakeholder groups. Each of these stakeholder groups have separate sub-interest groups. So personally, I'm an official voting member of the new TLD applicant group as part of the registry stakeholder group, as part of the contracted party house that reports to the GNSO Council, which is part of the at-large multi-stakeholder groups. It's part of ICANN. So I feel I'm a super powerful person. Don't piss me off. Because obviously, if you zoom like 7 times into this organization, you can find my name, right? And this is not an accident. The complexity is a feature, and it's a feature that allows the incumbent powers to control ICANN. I represent our new little company, Artemis Internet. We're doing some crazy stuff. We're applying for .secure. We're doing some other gTLD security stuff. You could tell me how stupid an idea of that is on Twitter later if you want. That's fine. You wouldn't be the only one. But I represent us at ICANN, which means I kiss my kids goodbye and I fly to Costa Rica or Toronto or Prague 4 times a year, and I'm only able to physically sit in one mind-numbing, brain-liquefying meeting at once. Right? But there are, at any one moment, 4 or 5 of those meetings going on. And so if you're VeriSign and you send literally 20 lawyers and public policy people to an ICANN meeting, you have the ability to participate in the breadth of the entire process. And if you're somebody who's trying to disrupt the system or do something different, there's no way you're going to have that capability. And so the complexity here is also a barrier to entry that keeps any change from happening because you have to be huge and powerful to be able to afford to send that many people to Prague to sit there in horrible meetings all day and raise objections and ask for 30-day comment periods and all kinds of other crazy crap. So something to think about when we talk about the process. ICANN decided several years ago, they voted like we're gonna expand the internet namespace. There have been a couple of expansions like .museum, .mobi, .info. Those were these very kind of specialized processes where specific companies went and lobbied ICANN, and it was like a big fight, and nobody really knew what the process should be. And so ICANN said, we're gonna make this a standardized process. Everybody's gonna apply it once. We're gonna look at all of them at once. And the theory is this new gTLD process is going to go on forever. That we're doing it right now for 1,500, 1,400 something applicants almost 1,500 applicants. But then once they get the process going, it will be a rolling process where at any moment you can apply for your own gTLD string. All you need to do that is a $185,000 application fee and 320 pages of documentation. So actually we spent, our company, about $650,000 in total between paying that fee and then paying people to sit around and write 320 pages of documentation. And so you submit all that stuff, and then you have this incredibly simple process where ICANN goes through and makes all these judgments about whether or not you should be allowed to run a registry. An interesting part of this is there's no part of this incredibly complex flowchart where somebody actually sits down and says, is this a good idea? Which, ICANN is kind of institutionally terrified of being sued and of legal problems. And the result is they've taken out any kind of subjective judgment of goodness or the rightness of something. And it's all based upon things that literally Deloitte or KPMG can go, and their audit people can go and check off boxes. And so you go through this whole process, and down here people can object, and this is called the contention area. So if you make it all the way through, and multiple people make it all through for one string, then they try to encourage you guys to work it out. And if you don't work it out, it goes to an auction. And there's a one-day auction where there's an unlimited budget, and you have to bid on a name, a gTLD name. And so literally you're going to have people doing the auction with their board of directors on a speakerphone saying, am I allowed to go to $24 million? Can I go to 24? Great. You're going to do $24 million, you'll wait 15 minutes, it'll go to 25 million. And now you have to ask for more money, which is going to be a very interesting day, obviously, for a lot of people. So one of the things ICANN wanted to do was allow companies to have their own namespaces, brand namespaces. People call these .brands. And so they created a process by which their exceptions can be given that the normal rules say that if you're a registry, you have to kind of operate it for everybody's benefit, right? VeriSign can't just decide, we're going to own .com and kick everybody off .com, right? They're not allowed to do that. But they wanted to create an exception, so if you're Xerox, you can own .Xerox. And if you're Fidelity, you can get .Fidelity. Those are real applicants. Apple applied for .Apple. We like .Bugatti because it turns out buying an actual Bugatti is more expensive than buying the entire namespace, .Bugatti. But this is exactly the kind of thing that ICANN wanted to create. And I'm glad you guys are laughing because I'm getting really self-conscious of all these people laughing over here, right? So the next time I say something funny, laugh really loud and make him feel bad, whoever's in that room. And so, they did this, and the idea was that companies can apply for their own namespaces. We're entering this interesting public policy issue because a couple of big incumbent internet players saw a loophole here. And the loophole was the .brand rules don't define what the brand is. And so we have this situation where people are applying for dozens or hundreds of generic terms and then saying they want to use it all for themselves. So Amazon applied for 76 names, Google applied for 101. For all 76 names, Amazon says that they will be the only people able to use them, right? So they want .author, and they will not sell .author, Stephen King.author to Stephen King. If you go to StephenKing.author, it's going to go to Amazon. And Google wants .search, and they're not going to let Bing.search exist. Anything under .search is only going to go to Google, right? And this is kind of controversial, as you can imagine. And we are not disinterested parties here because Amazon is our only competitor for the .secure namespace. But there's a lot of discussion about this. And what this discussion brings up is a meta point. And something I wrote to one of these companies about this issue is I feel like these ICANN meetings, we're talking about these very specific little ICANN issues, and it's kind of like the deck chair interest group of the passenger services organization on the HMS Titanic, right? Or RMS Titanic. We're talking about these little issues when there's this big meta issue that we're not thinking about, which is right now a bunch of governments are trying to push to get the ITU, which sets telephone standards and is part of the UN, to take over for ICANN. Right? And the list of governments that want to do that are friends of freedom, like the People's Republic of China and the Russian Federation, right? So, obviously they want to do that for the goodness of all internet users. But the real problem here is, you can't see it here, but Amazon applied for .book in Chinese, right? So if a bookstore from Seattle owns .book in Chinese for the next 50 years, and that's what we're talking about here, we're talking about a half century or a century here, the first contracts for 10 years, and nobody's ever had their contract not renewed. right? So if Amazon owns .book in Chinese for 50 years, then all the crap that the Chinese say about ICANN turns out to totally be true, right? It actually is a tool of Anglophone, super rich Western companies to dominate the internet. And so, this is an interesting public policy thing that's going to have to be worked out soon, because I kind of like, the fact that ICANN is so disorganized and crazy means that it can't really do anything evil, right? There's not enough competence there to take over the internet and do something evil. And so I think we should keep it that way, so that they can all argue about stuff while more competent people try to keep the internet free and open for all. And so another interesting issue that's still being argued over is whether or not the top-level domains will have A records and MX records in them, so that you can mail somebody just at Gmail, right? Or if I can go just to http://Kindle or //Apple. Right? Right now, that's against the rules, although there are a bunch of countries that break the rules. They're not supposed to, but countries are sovereign. They're countries. There's nothing ICANN can really do about it, right? But nobody in the gTLD space does it. Now, this has a really interesting problem, which is a lot of the 1,400 rules, 1,400 applied names overlap with legitimate internal server names that you can currently purchase certificates for. So if you really care about this, the CA browser forum has guidance that says that non-fully qualified domains are not supposed to be sold after sometime in 2013, but then those certificates are good until 2015. So right this moment, if you want, I would strongly suggest this, if you're a bad guy, you should go look up the 1,400 words and go buy certificates for all of these right now, and you will have a window of time during which you can have a wildcard cert to do a man-in-the-middle attack against all of these generic terms between 2013 when the gTLDs go live and 2015 when that cert runs out. For example, we wanted to get .Bugatti, and we went through, we didn't actually buy it, because we didn't want to spend the money, but for less than 10K, you can get star.bugatti via a managed PKI service provider. I'm not going to say whom, but they have a very large booth on the floor downstairs if you want to go thank them for that. Any questions on kind of the technical stuff before we get into the higher level things? Okay, so what's the big picture here? So we talked about, scarcity is going away. IPv4 has 4 billion addresses. Less than 4 billion are actually usable due to certain things being reserved. That is a reasonable number, right? One of my co-founders, Jesse Burns, is sitting down here, and he worked on a project called the SSL Observatory, where they did SSL scanning of the entire IPv4 internet. And that was something they could do. They just rented a bunch of AWS nodes, threw a credit card down, and ran it for a couple of months. And they grabbed every SSL certificate on the entire internet. The difference between 2 to the 32 and 2 to the 128 is so ridiculous that I'm not going to insult you by coming up with some kind of stupid metaphor. Let's just say it's ridiculous, right? It's big. And the end of the scarcity actually affects a lot of things. So, some of the assumptions we make because of scarcity, we assume that individual human beings have a reasonably, during their normal activities, have a reasonably tight bond to a small number of IP addresses. So while we think that IP addresses are anonymous, they aren't, right? There's a lot of interesting legal cases around the tie between humans and IPs, which the EFF people, I see several of them sitting out here, can answer for you. But in reality, if you think about it, in my normal week, if I'm not traveling internationally especially, I probably, in a normal week, probably use 20-something IPv4 addresses, right? I've got my home DSL IP address, which only rotates every couple of months. Mine, actually, I change the MAC address and rotate it every day, which is a good reason to buy sonic.net. There's a little advertisement for them. But generally, people have the same stack IP at home for several months at a time. I've got the IP address on my phone, which actually doesn't change as much as you would expect. Watch your IP address even while you travel around to different cell sites. It's defined based upon basically metropolitan regions, and unless you leave that metropolitan region, you will most likely keep the same IPv4 address through the entire thing. I've got the Starbucks I go to, I've got the pizza I go to, I've got a couple of IP addresses at work. But if you are able to watch all of my traffic, you can build a reasonably good model of what IP addresses I am always at. Another assumption we have is that because there's a big scarcity of domain names, that anything that sounds like a specific company is going to belong to that company, right? Because at this point, they've either sued the person who got it or they paid them off and got the money. Now, there's a handful of exceptions. A great example is Nissan.com belongs to a guy named Mike Nissan, who has been under like constant legal assault by Nissan Motors for 14 years, and he's still holding in there. God bless his soul. And he's got like, the guy's got this awesome, you should go to Nissan.com because he's got this awesome page with like a waving American flag, and it's pretty cool. But like other, examples like that are so rare as to be comical, right? That is certainly not going to be true when we blow out 1,432 new gTLDs, and there's this huge race to jump on names, especially words that are not trademarked and therefore are not protected by the multiple protection mechanisms that I'll talk about in a second. And then another assumption that we have is that IP spoofing is not an easy thing to do if you need a full connection. Obviously, if you're doing a SYN flood, if you're doing an attack that only requires a UDP packet or an ICMP packet, you do not need to use a real source address. But if you want to establish a real TCP connection, you need to get that SYN-ACK to come back to you, assuming there's not some kind of crazy SYN guessing problem, which most of those things have been fixed, right? But generally, you have to have that SYN-ACK come back to you. And to be able to establish a full TCP connection and do any kind of attack that requires real communication. That is an assumption that's obviously going away, and it's going away hard. So, things that use this. Anti-fraud and adaptive authentication. Who here works for a company that uses like an adaptive fraud system? Any banks, insurance companies? Okay, well, people are lying now. That's fine. A lot of people in here use it. Every single one of you has an institution you interact with that uses this, right? Almost certainly when you log into your bank does a web service call, most likely to RSA. They're the biggest player in this, but there are smaller players. They do a web service call saying that, Sally McGuffin is logging in from this IP address in Wisconsin. What do you think I should do? And RSA says, well, look, that looks like Sally McGuffin's proper Internet Explorer user agent. That's her home IP address. We've seen her come from there before. It's daytime in Wisconsin, and she's set to English. Sally, this looks good. I'm going to give you a risk rating of 4, right? And then when the bank does a web service call that says Sally McGuffin is logging in from the Ukraine using a Russian language version of IE, or of Firefox, and it's currently 2 a.m. in Wisconsin, then RSA returns a slightly higher score, saying you might want to be careful, right? That's called adaptive authentication. A lot of that is based upon IP reputation. That is all destroyed, right? Blown away. IPv6, it's all gone. These processes are become totally useless in IPv6 world. DDoS prevention and rate limiting, any kind of system that watches traffic and doesn't have the ability to differentiate traffic based upon the content, but only differentiates upon the source. Not only is there's a problem because people can switch, in DDoS attacks and other kinds of attacks, what their IP address is, but the problem is you can't even start to address the issue because you can't track state. And this is a fundamental issue that we're all going to have to deal with in security world. 10, 15 years ago, it was not easy to have hardware that could handle a massive SYN flood that comes from all kinds of different sources, partially because it's difficult to track state for all of the different IP addresses, right? But today, a standard load balancer you buy has a hash table that can have 4 billion entries. That's a data structure problem that has been solved. That is a hardware problem that has been solved. You will never be able to buy a piece of hardware before the heat death of the sun that will be able to track to the 128 different source IPs, right? That is never going to happen. And so kind of from a fundamental perspective, we cannot build hardware and software that tracks state in the IPv6 world. Not based upon just the IP address. We have to look for other kinds of hints and clues to batch up traffic and flows into things that are much smaller buckets than based upon source IP. And then IDS, SIEM, and event correlation machines, a lot of, when you do instant response, you do operations, a lot of that is based upon the ability to map multiple identities into one single identity, right? So I know Bob is logged into Bob's laptop. Bob's laptop is in Active Directory. From Active Directory, I can query and say Bob's laptop has this DHCP address. And this is like on an internal network. This DHCP address was given out by an Active Directory enabled DHCP server. Bob's laptop has these IP addresses. I'm able to correlate Bob's laptop and IPv4 address. That correlation is a lot harder in the IPv6 world with Slack and all that kind of stuff. And so the tools that allow you to do that are going to have to get a lot smarter, because otherwise it's going to be very difficult to sit down and understand that all of these flows are actually coming from the same machine, right? You don't want to have to be doing, Wiresharks on individual switch ports to be able to do this stuff. This is the kind of thing that you expect your extraordinarily expensive ICEM product to do for you, and in the IPv6 world, it doesn't. In fact, these things often just break, or they don't display IPv6 addresses correctly. Some of them can't even handle the fact that you have double dot notation, where you shrink in IPv6. They'll think that those are two different IPs instead of expanding out correctly, all kinds of stuff. This is a real simple example. If you want to do rate limiting in snort, the only mechanism you have is the track by source, which has no knowledge of the idea of IPv6 prefixes and routing, and only tracks on a per IP basis, which is obviously completely useless in the IPv6 world. So things to adopt, we're going to have network reputation instead of IP reputation, which means that when you see a packet and you make a decision on it, you're going to have to intelligently decide where's the prefix, where's the subnet, and where do I want to attach my reputation to, right? You can already throw away the last 64 bits, almost certainly, unless it's a positive reputation thing. But if it's a negative reputation, you throw away the last half and try to make an intelligent decision on what that network is. Obviously, there's lots of problems here, right? Comcast is only going to have a handful of IPv6 64-bit prefixes, and you don't want one schmuck destroying reputation of every single person in Comcast, right? And so, again, you're going to have much more intelligent things that say, well, this prefix was assigned to a tiny little company, therefore we're going to treat them all as one. This prefix is all of AT&T, therefore we have no ability to track reputation across this entire prefix, right? We're going to have bitter filtering of network bogons of non-existent IP ranges. Who here's on Nanog, on the Nanog mailing list? Yeah, so this is a fun mailing list. It's the secret mailing list of pudgy white guys that actually run the internet, all with beards. And like the two guys that raise their hands both have horrible facial hair. So my theory has been confirmed by the sample of n equals 2. So Nanog, I recommend you, if you're interested in internet infrastructure and internet infrastructure security issues, I recommend you subscribe to it. And some of the things you'll see are reports like the autonomous system squatting report, right? And people doing things like, who the heck is taking over this IP range? It's mine. And every day, autonomous systems on the internet make a mistake and they will advertise IP ranges don't belong to them. But because IPv4 space is so rare, it's pretty much all been given out. Almost all of it's been given out. If you jump into an IPv4 space that you're not supposed to have, somebody else is going to complain about it. They're going to notice and they're going to complain about it. Not true with IPv6. Lots of free space, right? And so we're entering a world where if you own an autonomous system that's connected up to the BGP6 world, you're going to be able to create new IP spaces just for specific attacks and then make them disappear and have very little record exist that they existed at all, which is going to be really a lot of fun when you're dealing with state-sponsored APTs, where we already have situations like China Telecom taking over huge chunks of the internet for 15 minutes accidentally, which is going to be real interesting in the IPv6 world, where it's going to be much harder to notice that stuff because they're not going to be squatting on anybody else's IP ranges. And then, as ISPs and companies are all going to have intelligent egress filtering. Right now, it's good enough to egress filter on, these are my subnets. I'm not going to let any traffic out, not from this subnet. But that's not good enough because letting out things from your subnet means there's 2 to the 64 options for attackers to do outbound control channels and attacks against other organizations. You're going to need to intelligently track which IP addresses have been given out, assign them to this belongs to Bob, this belongs to this person, and then base egress filtering on that. Currently, there are no products you can buy that do that, but if you want to go invent one, you can have a whole booth at Black Hat next year. So, other issues, we talk a lot about with DNSSEC, that protects the mapping of PayPal.com to an IP address. And then we do a lot of work to make sure when I talk to that IP address, I'm talking really to them. That's what TLS is for, and DANE, and all that kind of stuff. But a mapping that we often don't think about is in that person's head, right? That person in their head said, I want to go to PayPal so I can send somebody money. I want to go to the real PayPal with all of the money, right? And they know right now to type PayPal.com, which is going to get real interesting when PayPal.rugby or PayPal.movie or PayPal.london exist, which they may next year. And so things that you need to be thinking of right now if you work for a company that doesn't want your customers attacked. And that should be probably everybody in the room, except the unemployed people. So right now, you need to be involved in the ICANN new gTLD process. You need to be looking through the list of new gTLDs and looking for 2 things. One, you want to look for gTLDs that you think can be used to impersonate you specifically. You also want to be looking for gTLDs that your competitors are creating that you think is unfair, that they could have an unfair advantage on you, right? So Fidelity is applying for .IRA and .mutual fund and .retirement. So if you're Vanguard, E-Trade, or Schwab, you might be a little pissed about that, right? That is something that you have to be taking care of right now. And if it's so close to your brand, it's bad. There is an official ICANN objection process. You have to pay 10,000 euros to start that objection process, so it's not cheap. But it's worth it if somebody's actually going for your brand. And there's all kinds of other stuff you can do. Come talk to me if that's an actual problem that you have. The next thing that you'll have to protect yourself at the second level. So this is first level, top level domain protection. Second level domain protection, one thing that ICANN is planning is this thing called the Trademark Clearinghouse. And the theory is before the new gTLDs come live, you will be able to go to the Trademark Clearinghouse, say, look, I've got a trademark. I do not want this trademark given out to anybody. And then they'll give you a secret code. And for that trademark to be purchased under any new gTLD, you'll have to provide that secret code to the registrar to do the purchase, right? This is going to be a complete and total mess for many, many reasons. One reason is nobody's come up with an architecture that can actually handle the load that, when these new gTLDs come on, you're going to get all the domain squatters doing tens of millions of requests per minute, web service requests against their EPP endpoints, which are SOAP requests. And building a trademark clearinghouse that can do that times 1,400 hasn't been invented yet, right? Or ever. The other problem is that right now the rules say that any trademark is good. So this should be a lot of fun when Apple Computer goes and bring the Apple trademark from the US and the EU, and then somebody has a trademark from Kenya, and somebody has a trademark from India, right? And they all get the trademark clearinghouse, and there's going to be this huge fight, and all kinds of crazy stuff. There's a thing called the sunrise period. So say you miss the trademark clearinghouse, or you do it, or you're not able to do it because you want a word that's generic, right? So if you're buy.com, you cannot use the trademark clearinghouse to keep buy.rugby or buy.movie from being given out. That's not going to be allowed. So your next best thing is to go during the sunrise period, which is supposed to be the 30-day opening period of a new gTLD, and go grab it. And this is require you to actively know what new gTLDs are coming live, and then to go buy them. A lot of people are thinking that they're not going to have to buy their brand in every new gTLD. I think that's stupid, right? You do not want to leave these things in play where somebody can get them. You're just going to have to buck up and spend the money and buy them. I'm sorry, it sucks. I didn't invent this thing. I apologize. But it's really what you're going to want to do, and you're going to want to do that during the sunrise period, because otherwise you're going to go into an auction with somebody, or you're going to have to try to sue them for it, which is going to be much more expensive than just buying it during the sunrise. And then there's this thing called uniform rapid suspension, which is highly controversial and will be very controversial to people in this room, because this is a mechanism that, because of the new gTLD world, that is going to allow trademark holders to very quickly and cheaply get domains shut off. Right now, it's a big fight via WIPO. There's a big process that you have to go through to get a domain taken down. URS is going to be an almost totally automated mechanism to do that, which is kind of crazy. And so if you care about internet freedom and internet public policy, I would recommend keeping an eye on this. Right now, it looks like it's not going to exist because ICANN already set a price of about $500 per argument, basically, and nobody wants to run it for that much, right? So nobody bid on, I want to run that for $500. That's crazy. So it may or may not exist by the time these things come live next year. Other things you need to pay attention to is homographs. So all the new gTLDs, many of them are going to support IDNs. We're also, for the first time, going to have IDN gTLDs. And so in your Splunk logs and in your ArcSite, you're going to start to see 3 Chinese characters dot 3 Chinese characters as the reverse DNS lookup on IP addresses. Not to pick on a specific country, but these are also represented as a thing called Punycode, which is an encoding that is slightly more readable than a language that you don't read, but not much more readable. And obviously, this is not going to be a lot of fun to try to do this in real time, like an instant response. This gets interesting because the browsers are all trying to address the problem of homographs in different ways. Internet Explorer and Chrome are the most aggressive in preventing these attacks. They use your actual system settings and your browser language settings to try to decide whether or not to show you an IDN, right? So if you don't speak Chinese and you've told Windows that, if you go to a Chinese website, it will show you the Punycode by automatically. Same with Chrome. Firefox is a whitelist of top-level domains that have promised, we swear we're not going to give out any homographs. That is a totally unrealistic promise. The Firefox people know that. They have a public policy paper where they're trying to decide on more technological means to prevent it. Opera is following Firefox's lead. Safari is our big winner here. Safari uses the default WebKit mechanism for deciding what IDNs are allowed, and the way it does it is it has a list of the Unicode character sets that are allowed to exist, and they're allowed to exist in a mixed situation. And this is the list of languages that Safari will show you a name in, which it seems completely random to me. Anybody know what Desiree is? What's Desiree, sir? Wow. So this man's like a human Wikipedia. So the Desiree is the secret language that Mormons invented in the early 19th century to write letters to each other when they were being persecuted by the United States. And it's not even taught by the LDS Church anymore, but it's like this archived, made-up secret language. And it is one of the handful of languages that you're allowed to have an IDN in Safari, which I think is awesome. Also, you look at this list, this obviously is not going to last because, there are a couple of like Indian languages, but we're missing Hindi. So that's kind of like a big FU to 800 million Hindi speakers, right? And a bunch of other, there's one Han Chinese, but there's a bunch of different, what? No, yeah, Devanagari is not Hindi. Gujarati, a bunch of these are like Sanskrit-based languages, but they're not actually Hindi. Okay, well, I'm not going to get into an Indian language discussion, so I'm sorry. We're running out of time. But you can totally find me later or on Twitter. Alex Stamos is a racist who doesn't understand Indian languages. But anyway, this is obviously going to have to change. This is not how you're going to want to do this. So anyway, other things are going to have to change. One of the ideas of IPv6 is to reestablish the end-to-end principle. For those of you who had like kind of an academic CS background, you probably read a paper called the end-to-end principle, which is the idea that the network is stupid, right? That the network is dumb and it moves packets back and forth, and all the intelligence on the network is built into the endpoints, right? This has been broken through a number of mechanisms, most importantly via NAT. And this is IPv6, and some people's dream is to reestablish it, right? In a proper, if you read like the Cisco or the Microsoft official books on deploying IPv6, they tell you how to get an official IPv6 prefix, load it into your routers, and for every desktop on your network to now have a publicly addressable IP address, right? So it's like you're working at Sun in 1984, and your Spark station has a public IP address that can route to any other public IP address. That's the future that we're looking at. Firewalls would have to actually do real firewalling in a situation like that, not just be NAT boxes that don't have to have any intelligence. You would need NAT64 mechanism for IPv4, and you would use a next generation IPv6-based VPN mechanism like direct access, which is the official way of doing this on Windows networks, which is a really cool technology that is also terrifying at the same time. Will this happen? Realistically, in the next 4 or 5 years, what we're going to see is a mix of IPv6 publicly addressable, and then NAT IPv4, right? So you're going to have a publicly addressable IPv6, NAT and IPv4 on the same machine, and you're going to have weird kind of detection mechanisms. Windows will try to detect whether it can actually get out via IPv6, and if not, it will fall back to IPv4. And so we're going to have a weird thing like that until you actually turn on NAT 6 to 4 or actually native IPv6. And on a connection for connection basis, your operating system is going to have to make an intelligent decision on how to route. We're probably going to have lots of public addresses with non-public routing. So just because you give a globally unique public IP address to a machine doesn't mean that actually has to go out, right? And so one of the things that we didn't talk about too much, but IPv6 has a 16-bit subnet space. So you can create 65,535 different subnets in your organization under a routable IPv6 address prefix. Yeah, I'm going to blow right past it, sorry. Dino and Alex can wait. And look awesome in the back. Anyway, sorry. So what I think organizations are going to do is you're going to make up rules like the top half of that 16-bit space is going to be publicly routable, and the bottom half is not going to be publicly routable. And so you'll have like RFC 1918 space, but you'll never have collisions in the space in your organization, and then you'll want to go onto your edge routers and make sure those rules are enforced. So even if you screw up the firewall at some point, a set of 32,000 subnets are not going to be allowed to leave the organization at all. And I think realistically what this means is that proxies are going to become extremely important. Like I said, right now, Windows 7 installed in a company that has Slack installed, it has 3 IP addresses. It has 2 IPv6 addresses, one of them based upon its MAC address, one randomly generated for private addressing, and it has the IPv4 address it gets from DHCP. And so tying the 3 of those together is not a simple thing. I don't think there's any products that do it for you automatically. And realistically, if you're trying to track all of the traffic that comes off of that to the internet because you're looking for control channels, the best way to do it is going to route all the traffic through a proxy at a higher level and then do authentication at a higher level than at the IP level, which is great news for the proxy vendors, but not great use for some of the internet folks. So pros and cons for attackers in this new world. The pros are, we are going to have some endpoints or a greater number of endpoints that can be attacked directly, 80 style, that you're actually going to be able to route all the way to somebody's desktop. ARP spoofing is going away, but we have 6 new attacks to replace it. So just in time for people to have link local IDSs that understand ARP spoofing, they have to replace them with something else. It's going to be much easier to hide internal attacks, control channels, covert channels. I think a great thing would be if somebody comes up with a covert channel that only uses the source IPv6 address. It's 128 bits. You've got 64 bits of entropy in there to play with. You could build a whole covert channel that just uses the source and destination IPs, right? And has no other traffic in the packet, right? So you're gonna have all kinds of crazy stuff like that using IPv6, and multiple IP identities slowing down instant response. The cons, remote scanning of entire IP address ranges no longer reasonable. This is also a big con for those of you out there who've been making your money by doing really lazy pen tests, right? Where that you just look up their autonomous system number, you look up their assigned IP addresses, you do a scan, you're like, I did a pen test, right? That's not going to be possible anymore. Doing an IPv6 external network vulnerability assessment is going to have to require some kind of enumeration that does not include just incrementing by 1, right? And so that's true for both attackers and security consultants. And DNSSEC might be useful in some cases to thwart attackers, but not in many. So these are talks I would love to see people submit for next year. There's a lot of work to be done here, and I think people out in the audience can really expand, push the frontier here. So probably can take like 1 or 2 questions. Any questions? Great. Yeah. Yes, sir. Can you buy shares in ICANN? No. ICANN is a nonprofit. A nonprofit that had $350 million transferred into its bank account for the new gTLD program. So, any other questions? Okay, I'll be around if you want to chat. So, Tom, thank you.